In the rural outskirts of Mumbai, amidst barren fields, the laughter of children could be heard, ringing through the open landscape. Yet, among those voices, one girl stood apart, 12-year-old Dia, quietly working on the dry land, her small hands sinking into the soil, planting seeds not only for a crop but in the hope of a better life for her family. Dia never truly experienced childhood as others did. Her parents, impoverished farmers, toiled endlessly to secure each meal, but poor harvests and accumulating debts weighed heavily upon them. Dia, though still young, understood the weight of her family's sacrifices. Day by day, she grew stronger and more resilient, embracing the hardship and challenges life threw at her. The family's poverty shaped Dia into a person who valued perseverance. She learned early on that dreams were a luxury only the wealthy could afford, and those who were poor had little choice but to survive. However, deep down, Dia hoped for a life beyond the endless fields, beyond the unrelenting struggle. She dreamed of a different life, a life where she could be safe, respected, and, most importantly, happy. As Dia grew older, her parents began to discuss marriage. In their culture, it was customary for daughters to marry young, and for poor families like Dia's, it was seen as a way to offer her a better future. It was then that Dia was introduced to Kav, a young man from a nearby village, someone her parents believed would provide her with a stable life. Kav came from a family of wealth, a fact that made him desirable in the eyes of Dia's parents. They arranged the marriage with hope that Dia would find security, comfort, and maybe, even happiness in her new life. However, Dia's dreams were shattered shortly after she became Kav's wife. Kav, though outwardly charming and affluent, was plagued by an inner darkness. Born into privilege, he had grown up without ever knowing struggle or deprivation. Spoiled by his family's wealth, Kav led a life of indulgence and addiction, his vices fed by an endless stream of money. For him, gambling wasn't just a pastime, it was an obsession, a disease that consumed him. His debts mounted higher each day, and with no way to pay them off, he began to sink deeper into despair. Unbeknownst to Dia, Kav's life was spiraling out of control. The stability her parents had sought for her was a mere illusion, one that faded as quickly as it had appeared. She witnessed Kav's anger, his frustration, his hopelessness, and soon, she became the target of his wrath. Gone was the security she had longed for, in its place, she found only fear and misery. As Kav's financial troubles worsened, he became desperate. His family had turned their backs on him, refusing to rescue him from the debts he had accumulated. He was a man cornered, with no escape. In his desperation, he made a choice that would forever change Dia's life, a decision so heartless that it betrayed every bond of trust that marriage was supposed to uphold. One night, Kav came home with a strange, unsettling calm in his demeanor. He looked at Dia with a cold detachment that sent a shiver down her spine. Without warning, he told her to pack her belongings, saying he was taking her to meet someone important. Unaware of his true intentions, Dia obeyed, hoping that perhaps he had found a way out of his troubles, that maybe things would finally get better. But when they arrived at a dimly lit building on the outskirts of town, Dia's heart sank. Standing at the entrance was Raghav, a notorious gangster, known for his ruthlessness and power. Raghav controlled the area with an iron fist, his criminal empire extending deep into the veins of the city's underworld. He was feared and respected in equal measure, and his influence reached even the highest ranks of local government. Dia's confusion turned to terror as Kav exchanged words with Raghav, his demeanor submissive, almost pleading. She watched in horror as her husband, the man who had vowed to protect and cherish her, sold her to this ruthless stranger. In that single moment, Dia's life changed forever. Kav had sacrificed her freedom, her dignity, to settle his debts, a betrayal so profound that it left Dia numb. Raghav, with a twisted smile, reached out and took Dia's hand, his grip cold and unyielding. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in shock. Cav didn't look back as he walked away, leaving her in the hands of a man who saw her as nothing more than property, a means to an end. As Raghav led her away, Dia felt as if she were walking into a nightmare from which she would never wake. She looked back one last time, hoping that somehow, this was all a terrible mistake, that Cav would come back for her. But he didn't. In that instant, Dia knew that her life as she had known it was over. Dia's new life under Raghav's control was a descent into a personal hell. The freedom she had once taken for granted was ripped away, and her existence became confined to the dim, suffocating confines of Raghav's mansion, a fortress of decadence and terror. Every corner of this place reminded her of her captivity, each locked door and barred window a cruel reminder that escape was a distant dream. From the first day, Raghav made it painfully clear that she was no longer a person in his eyes, she was a possession, a tool to be used, broken, and discarded at his whim. His empire thrived on fear and violence, and to him, Dia was just another pawn in his dark world of crime. The moment she stepped through the doors of his mansion, Raghav unleashed his wrath, subjecting her to unrelenting abuse, both physical and psychological. Her days blurred into an endless nightmare, her body and spirit bruised and battered by his cruelty. Raghav's abuse wasn't confined to physical beatings, his words cut even deeper. He delighted in stripping away any semblance of humanity she had left, reminding her daily of her helplessness. He would sneer, calling her weak, insignificant, and undeserving of respect or mercy. The psychological torment was as relentless as the physical pain. Each day, she became more like a shadow, her once bright eyes dull with despair, her spirit drained of any spark of hope. Among Raghav's henchmen, Dia was seen as nothing more than the boss's property. They would pass her in the hallways, their cold gazes indifferent to her suffering. To them, she was invisible, and in their world, compassion was a sign of weakness. She was utterly alone, surrounded by people yet isolated in a way she had never known before. She yearned to scream, to demand justice, but her voice seemed lost, swallowed by the walls that held her captive. Months passed in this horrid limbo, each day blurring into the next. Dia's mind struggled to cling to memories of her former life, the quiet fields of her village, her family, the feeling of sunlight on her skin. But those memories grew distant, and she began to wonder if they were ever real at all. The life she had known seemed like a distant dream, a cruel fantasy compared to the cold reality she now faced. One evening, as Dia sat alone in the small, dark room where she was kept, she found herself spiraling into despair. The silence was suffocating, the darkness so complete that it felt like it was consuming her from within. In that moment, she realized that Raghav had not only taken her freedom, he had taken her identity. She no longer recognized the person she had become, a woman stripped of agency, trapped in a cage of fear and degradation. But despite the horror, there was a small, indomitable part of her that refused to die. A flicker of resistance, buried deep within, kept her from surrendering completely. She began to tell herself that one day, she would find a way out. She didn't know how or when, but she clung to that spark of hope like a lifeline. It was the only thing that kept her sane in the face of unrelenting torment. Her opportunity for escape came one stormy night in September 2018, nearly a year into her captivity. Raghav and his men were celebrating some criminal victory, their revelry echoing through the mansion as they drank and caroused. The guards, usually vigilant, had let their guard down, intoxicated and distracted by the festivities. Dia sensed that this might be her only chance. With her heart pounding, she slipped out of her room, moving as silently as she could. The dimly lit hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a reminder of the danger that lurked around every corner. She moved quickly, her fear mingling with the desperate hope of freedom. She knew she had to act fast. If she were caught, Rogov's wrath would be even more terrible than before. After what felt like an eternity, Dia finally reached the main door. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the lock, her breaths shallow and quick. She didn't dare to look back, didn't allow herself to think of what might happen if she failed. She had no plan beyond getting out, no place to go, no one to turn to. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was escaping the nightmare she had endured for far too long. As she slipped out into the night, the cool air hit her like a jolt, filling her lungs with a freedom she had almost forgotten. She ran, her bare feet pounding against the wet earth, her body moving with a determination fueled by months of suffering and desperation. She didn't stop, didn't look back, until the mansion was nothing more than a dark blot on the horizon. By dawn, Dia had reached the nearest police station, her clothes torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Trembling, she recounted her ordeal, pleading for protection and justice. But as she looked into the eyes of the police officers, she saw only indifference, and a coldness that made her blood run cold. Rogov's reach extended far beyond his mansion, his influence seeped into every corner of the city, even the very institutions meant to protect her. The officers listened to her story, nodding dismissively, before telling her there was nothing they could do. They advised her to leave, subtly implying that pursuing her case would only bring her more trouble. Dia's heart sank as she realized the depths of the corruption she was up against. She had escaped Rogov's mansion, but his power still held her captive. Dia left the police station feeling more defeated than ever. The walls of corruption surrounding her were higher than she had imagined, fortified by the very people meant to protect her. For days, she wandered the streets, alone and vulnerable, with nowhere to turn and no one willing to hear her cries for justice. Every glance over her shoulder was a reminder that Rogov's influence lurked in every shadow. Each day was a battle to stay hidden, as she feared being recaptured or silenced by Rogov's men. Dia's resolve, however, remained unbroken. She refused to let her suffering go unheard. By a stroke of fate, her story eventually reached the ears of Ronit, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for exposing powerful criminals and corruption. Ronit was relentless in his pursuit of truth, known for his investigative reporting on India's underground crime networks. When Dia's tale reached him, he was struck not only by the horror of her experiences but also by the cold indifference of the system that had failed her so profoundly. Determined to help, Ronit arranged a meeting with Dia in a discreet, secure location. When he saw her for the first time, he was shocked by the physical and emotional scars she bore, evidence of the unspeakable abuse she had endured. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, yet within those eyes was a spark of determination that touched him deeply. He realized then that Dia's story was not just another case, it was a call to action, a fight against the entrenched corruption and indifference that plagued the justice system. Over the next few weeks, Ronit and his team began their work. Dia, though hesitant at first, recounted her ordeal in painful detail, each word a testament to her strength. Ronit's team delved deep into Rogov's empire, uncovering layers of criminal activities that spanned trafficking, extortion, and bribery. It became clear that Rogov wasn't merely a local thug, he was part of a deeply rooted criminal network, one that operated under the protection of powerful officials who valued their alliance with him over justice. Ronit's investigation grew bolder, relying on undercover agents and informants to gather damning evidence. They uncovered documents linking Rogov's operation to high-ranking officials in the police force and even local politicians, all of whom were complicit in protecting him. Every revelation added fuel to Ronit's fire, and he knew this story was bound to shake the public and provoke a response from those in power. As they gathered footage, audio recordings, and testimonies, Ronit began to see the bigger picture. Dia was not Raghav's only victim. She was one among many, each story hidden behind closed doors, silenced by threats and violence. This realization strengthened his resolve. The weight of Dia's suffering, combined with that of countless others, made it clear that this wasn't just about exposing a crime, it was about demanding justice for every person who had suffered in silence. Finally, in early January 2019, Ronit aired the exposé on national television. The program, titled Dia's Story, The Silent Victims of Corruption, ran during prime time, ensuring maximum viewership. It was a chilling documentary, detailing the horrors Dia endured, her betrayal by her own husband, and the dark criminal empire that controlled her life. Footage of Dia's face, though blurred for her protection, stirred emotions in viewers nationwide. Her voice, quivering yet resolute, echoed through millions of homes, forcing people to confront the reality of the systemic corruption festering within their society. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers expressed their outrage on social media, demanding accountability from the authorities who had failed. Diameter public outcry reached unprecedented levels, with protests erupting in major cities, calling for a full investigation into Raghav's network and the corrupt officials shielding him. The collective voice of a nation, galvanized by Dia's suffering, could no longer be ignored. Under immense pressure from both the public and higher government bodies, the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, was ordered to intervene. With their involvement, Raghav's world began to crumble. The CBI conducted extensive raids on his properties, seizing documents, assets, and evidence of his illegal activities. Raghav's associates, once untouchable, were arrested one by one, their alliances with corrupt officials laid bare for the world to see. As Raghav's empire fell apart, so did his bravado. He was eventually captured in a high-stakes raid, an operation that involved dozens of officers and culminated in his dramatic arrest. As he was led away in handcuffs, Dia felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. This man, who had stripped her of her dignity and subjected her to unspeakable horrors, was finally facing justice. Yet, the cost of this victory weighed heavily on her. The scars he had left, both physical and emotional, would never truly fade. Dia hoped that with Raghav's arrest, she would finally find peace. But her journey was far from over. The legal battle that followed was grueling, a reminder of the system's flaws that had once allowed Raghav to operate with impunity. Though his crimes were indisputable, the case was drawn out, with Raghav's lawyers employing every tactic to delay proceedings. Dia had to relive her trauma in court, recounting her experiences before a judge, facing the scrutiny of the public and media. Throughout this ordeal, Ronit remained by Dia's side, offering her a support system she had lacked for so long. He continued to document her story, determined to ensure that the justice system did not fail her again. Public interest remained high, and each day of the trial saw new revelations about the corruption embedded within the government, with officials and officers being implicated and removed from their positions. However, Dia's hopes for a new beginning were soon to be shattered once more. As the case neared its conclusion, whispers of threats began to circulate. Raghav's associates, though weakened, still held influence, and Dia became a target once more. The very justice she had sought was now putting her in danger. As the trial progressed, Dia became a symbol of resilience and defiance in the face of an overwhelmingly corrupt system. Her story inspired protests, debates, and calls for reform in India's justice and law enforcement sectors. For the first time in her life, Dia felt seen, felt like her pain was being acknowledged by the world. Yet, in the shadows, Raghav's remaining allies plotted, resentful of her audacity to seek justice and expose their network. By the start of 2019, the case had reached national headlines, with public interest peaking. It seemed that India was finally waking up to the dark underbelly of its justice system. Despite the progress, Dia's life was under constant threat. She had been moved to a secure location under the protection of a few trusted CBI agents, but her safety was far from guaranteed. The influence of Raghav's associates extended beyond prison walls, and as the trial drew closer to a verdict, the threats against her intensified. One evening in mid-January, just days before the sentencing, Dia received a phone call from an unknown number. A cold, unfamiliar voice warned her, telling her to withdraw her statements or face consequences. Dia, already haunted by the shadows of her past, felt a chill as she realized how far Raghav's network still reached. Refusing to surrender, she held her ground, insisting that she would not be silenced. She had come too far, endured too much to let fear dictate her life once again. On January 20, 2019, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Inside, Raghav sat expressionless, his fate hanging in the balance. The courtroom was tense, with reporters, activists, and supporters filling every seat, awaiting justice for Dia and the countless others who had suffered in silence. The judge's words were met with a deafening silence as he pronounced Raghav guilty on multiple charges, including trafficking, abuse, and corruption. Raghav was sentenced to death, a landmark decision that brought a wave of relief to Dia and a sense of closure for those who had fought alongside her. However, as the crowd celebrated the verdict, tragedy struck. Just hours after the sentencing, Dia was found dead in her safe house. Her death sent shockwaves across the nation, a cruel twist in a story that had already been marred by so much pain and injustice. Initial reports pointed to an apparent break-in, and authorities speculated that Raghav's associates, enraged by the verdict, had sought to silence her once and for all. Dia's death transformed her story from a tale of survival to one of martyrdom, a symbol of the price paid for confronting deep-seated corruption. Ronit, devastated by the news, was determined to honor Dia's legacy. Fueled by grief and anger, he launched his own investigation, using every resource at his disposal to uncover the truth behind her murder. Dia's death, he believed, was not only an attack on her but on every survivor who had hoped for justice. His team combed through surveillance footage, interviewed guards, and retraced Dia's last steps, piecing together what they could. In the weeks that followed, Ronit's findings exposed shocking details. It became evident that Dia's murder had been meticulously planned. Her death was no random act of revenge, it was a calculated move to erase her from the public eye, to stifle the impact of her story. High-ranking officials who had been implicated by her testimony were among the suspected masterminds. These were people who could not afford for Dia's story to continue shedding light on the corrupt practices that had shielded them for so long. Despite mounting evidence and Ronit's relentless pursuit, Dia's actual killer was never identified. Those with the power to investigate the case further seemed to deliberately let it go cold, allowing the truth to slip away into the void of unresolved cases. Her story became a powerful reminder of how deeply entrenched corruption could manipulate justice to protect itself. The outcry that followed her murder forced authorities to announce reforms, promises of stricter regulations and better protections for victims and witnesses, though Dia's tragedy loomed as a grim testament to how far the nation still had to go. Months passed, and Dia's story lingered in the hearts of those who had followed her case. Her face became an emblem of the fight against systemic injustice, her name a rallying cry for reform. Ronit's documentary, Dia's Legacy, A Nation's Call for Justice, aired to record-breaking audiences, sparking national debates and spurring initiatives to address the deep-rooted issues exposed by her case. He dedicated his work to her memory, vowing to keep her story alive as a reminder of the cost of standing up to power. Dia's legacy resonated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Her life, once confined to the quiet struggles of poverty and obscurity, had become a symbol of hope, courage, and the urgent need for change. In every protest demanding police accountability, in every movement for women's rights, and in every cry for a better system, Dia's spirit endured. She had died seeking justice, and though she had been silenced, her voice echoed louder than ever. And so, while her case remained unresolved, Dia's memory continued to inspire a new generation of activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens who believed in the possibility of a better, fairer society. Her story had touched millions, stirring hearts and minds and igniting a spark that refused to die. Even as her killer walked free, the fight she had started raged on, and her life became a poignant reminder that sometimes, change comes at an unbearable cost. The final chapter of Dia's story remained open-ended, a mystery haunting those who had followed her journey. But her life, marked by resilience and tragedy, left a mark on a country, challenging it to look within, to confront its darkness, and to fight for the day when no one else would have to suffer the way Dia had.